Good morning. Governor Ueda, thank you for hosting this conference and inviting me. My name is Neil Kashkari, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. I'm honored to chair the Mayekawa lecture and introduce my friend, Don Kohn. Don holds the Robert V. Rusa Chair in International Economics and is a senior fellow in the Economic Studies program at the Brookings Institution. Don is a 40-year veteran of the Federal Reserve System, serving ultimately as a member of the Board of Governors and as its vice chair during a term of from 2002 to 2010. He then went on and served as an external member of the Financial Policy Committee at the Bank of England from 2011 to 2021. Prior to taking office as a member of the Board of Governors, Don served on a number of staff roles at the Board of Governors, including as Secretary of the Federal Open Market Committee and as a Division Director of Monetary Affairs. I want to just mention that I got to know Don during the financial crisis when I was at the U.S. Treasury Department, and Don was one of the key architects of the Fed's response to the GFC. And it was a pleasure working with you then. Please join me in welcoming Don Kohn.
Thank you, Neil. Indeed, we were in like adjacent foxholes, I think, from 2008, 2009. Thank you, Governor Ueda, for inviting me. And it's great to see so many old friends, particularly lots of Bank of Japan friends from days gone by. It's a terrific opportunity. Thank you. I'm honored to deliver this conference's Mayekawa lecture. Governor Ueda asked me to reflect on central bank independence, drawing on my experience and the lessons history offers for protecting it. Threats to independence have risen sharply in the United States to levels not seen since the Fed Treasury Accord of 1951. My remarks will draw primarily on the institutional political circumstances in the United States, but speeches by central bankers outside the U.S. suggest these concerns are broader, and preserving independence has become among the defining institutional challenges of the moment. I'll start by defining independence and documenting the growing pressures against it. I'll ask why these pressures have intensified and what central banks can do in response. In addition to my own experience, I'll draw on conversations with a number of current and former central bankers that I had as I prepared these remarks. I suspect no one in this audience doubts the importance of insulating central banks to some degree from short-term political pressures. We have extensive evidence across time and across countries that when politicians control monetary policy, electoral incentives make it difficult to sustain a credible commitment to price stability. Recognizing the need for a longer horizon, elected representatives have delegated authority to independent central banks with clearly defined objectives, most often price stability, or in the case of the U.S., maximum employment and price stability. In a democracy, however, delegated authority has limits. In the United States, it applies primarily to monetary policy in the pursuit of that dual mandate, does not extend to regulatory authority, which is more inherently political and is coordinated with other federal and state agencies. But it does encompass lender of last resort functions for banks to support financial stability, and I'll come back later to the, I think, very complicated intersection of central bank independence and financial stability. Democratic accountability is maintained in the give and take between central banks and the elected representatives, and control is asserted over the medium and long term through the appointments process. In the U.S., Federal Reserve governors are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Independence rests on both laws and norms. Legally, the Federal Reserve controls its own budget. Governors serve long, staggered terms. Chairs and vice chairs are designated for fixed four-year terms, and governors can only be removed for cause, generally understood to mean serious misconduct in office rather than policy disagreement. Reserve Bank presidents who participate in monetary policy deliberations as effectively external members of the policy committee are chosen by regional boards subject to the approval of the Federal Reserve Board. But legal protections alone are insufficient. Independence also depends on norms. Appointing technically qualified officials willing to exercise independent judgment, respecting the diversity of views among Reserve Bank presidents, and the principle that policy disagreement is not a grounds for dismissal. It is this final norm that President Trump, in effect, has been challenging. President Trump's efforts to exert greater control over the Fed are unusual in scale and intensity, accompanied by sustained and often personal criticisms of Chair Powell and Federal Reserve policy. To be sure, presidents have long preferred lower interest rates. Some have voiced that preference publicly, others have exerted substantial pressure behind the scenes. Think about Lyndon Johnson and William McChesney Martin, Richard Nixon and Arthur Burns. History suggests, however, that when central banks yield to sustained political pressure for easier policy, inflation often follows. The limited congressional response to recent threats has been troubling. Legislators in both parties generally understand and defend the principle of central bank independence, but many Republicans appear reluctant to challenge the president directly, while Democrats, though often supportive of independence, have historically placed greater emphasis on the employment side of the dual mandate and have not always been equally comfortable with an independent central bank prioritizing price stability. The broader economic environment may intensify these political pressures. In many advanced economies, including the United States, rising public debt implies growing debt service burdens that constrain governments' fiscal choices, especially if higher interest rates are needed to contain inflation. At the same time, several structural disinflationary forces that supported price stability between 1990 and 2019 are weakening or reversing. Trade liberalization and the integration of large economies into global markets lowered costs and supported disinflation during that earlier period. Today, tariffs, industrial policy, and efforts to build more resilient supply chains may work in the opposite direction. Recent years have also been marked by adverse supply shocks, as Governor Ueda reminded us. Energy price spikes following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and conflict in the Middle East, tariff increases. These shocks raise prices while reducing real incomes, effects monetary policy cannot fully offset. Yet they also heighten public dissatisfaction with economic outcomes and increase the temptation for political leaders to assign blame to central banks. Ironically, these circumstances strengthen rather than weaken the case for independence. When inflationary pressures arise from forces beyond monetary policy's control, political incentives to demand short-term relief become stronger, even as the need for disciplined policy becomes greater. President Trump's efforts to pressure the Federal Reserve may be extreme, but they emerge from a broader political and economic developments. Across many democracies, populist movements have drawn strength from dissatisfaction with economic outcomes, especially rising inequality, stagnant mobility, and pessimism about the future. These movements are often characterized by distrust of technocrats who are perceived as distant from the concerns of much of the population. Populist movements also tend to be skeptical of globalization, the freer movement of goods, capital, and people across borders, which many citizens see as benefiting elites while leaving others behind. Economists often emphasize aggregate gains in efficiency and lower costs from globalization. Populist political movements focus more heavily on visible distributional consequences and the erosion of national autonomy. Rules-based systems and the international commitment may therefore be viewed less as safeguards and more as constraints on corrective action, including trade restrictions or industrial policy. Distrust of technocratic institutions is often accompanied by a preference for more centralized political authority and by increasing polarization of political life. The rapid spread of unfiltered information through social media has amplified these tendencies, making it harder to distinguish fact from fiction and more difficult to sustain confidence in expert institutions. Central banks are particularly vulnerable in this environment. By design, they are technocratic institutions. Their decisions depend on analysis, evidence, and long-term reasoning rather than immediate political responsiveness. They operate within an international system of cooperation. Central banks are often perceived, fairly or not, as aligned with the interests of financial institutions rather than the broader public. Most importantly, central bank independence constrains elected leaders, which makes it a natural target for movements skeptical of institutional limits on political authority. Economic events over the past 2 decades have reinforced these pressures on central banks. The Federal Reserve was criticized for failing to foresee or prevent vulnerabilities that contributed to the global financial crisis and later for the inflation surge in 21-23. Both episodes had multiple causes, many outside the control of central banks, but central banks are ultimately held responsible for financial and price stability, and failures, whether perceived or real, can erode public confidence. Crisis response also generated backlash. Near zero interest rates and large-scale asset purchases were criticized for widening wealth inequality and blurring the boundary between fiscal and monetary policy. Emergency lending during the financial crisis was portrayed as bailouts, favoring financial institutions over households harmed by the crisis. In the United States, the post-pandemic inflation miss was partly self-inflicted. In 2020, the FOMC adopted a revised framework that emphasized the benefits of a strong labor market and placed less weight on preemptive responses to inflation risks. In my view, the framework and its implementation and forward guidance on rates and purchases contributed to a delayed response to emerging inflation pressures in 2021. The Federal Reserve also justified aspects of the framework in part by reference to employment opportunities for historically disadvantaged demographic groups. However well-intentioned, this risks stretching a narrow macroeconomic mandate toward objectives that monetary policy is not well suited to achieve with a single instrument. Some central banks also entered politically contested terrain: Brexit in the United Kingdom, climate policy in Europe and the United Kingdom. Ethical lapses by several Federal Reserve officials related to financial trading further damage institutional credibility. Well, in this environment, what can central banks do to strengthen the support for independence? In a democracy, the degree of central bank independence ultimately depends on political support, reinforced by legal protections that are respected by the courts. Central banks therefore need to ask what they themselves can do to sustain that support in a more difficult political environment. At a high level, the answers are straightforward, though much easier to say than to implement. First, central banks should remain focused on the core objectives assigned by law and justified by experience: price stability and financial stability. They should avoid peripheral or politically contested objectives that risk distracting from those missions or diluting accountability. This is not simply a question of institutional restraint. Monetary policy is already difficult. Supplemental goals can complicate decision-making and blur the connection between policy actions and legislative objectives. That connection matters not only for accountability, but for policy effectiveness. Second, central banks must be as successful as possible. Competence is the strongest defense of independence. If central banks repeatedly fail to achieve their mandates, the rationale for delegating authority weakens. Of course, much lies outside their control: supply shocks, geopolitical events, fiscal choices, structural change. But central banks must provide a credible explanation of how policy will navigate those developments and return the economy toward the mandated objectives. And when policy falls short, candid analysis of mistakes can strengthen rather than weaken credibility. Third, communication matters. Central banks have made enormous progress in communicating with markets and academics. Reaching legislatures and the broader public, the ultimate arbiters of independence, has proven more difficult but also increasingly necessary. I'll organize the remainder of these remarks around those three themes: focus, success, and communication. I'll begin with monetary policy, drawing on the experience of three chairs with whom I worked most closely: Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, and Ben Bernanke. I'll then turn to the two especially difficult challenges for independence: unsustainable fiscal trajectories and financial instability. Monetary policy. Focus. For most central banks, price stability is their primary legal objective. Even for a dual mandate central bank like the Federal Reserve, price stability is a necessary condition for meeting its other goal of maximum employment on a sustained basis. When households and businesses don't have to factor a guess about future inflation into their decision making, uncertainty is reduced and resource allocation is more efficient. And by anchoring inflation expectations, credibility for achieving price stability gives scope for the central bank to lean against many disturbances to maximum employment. Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, and Ben Bernanke all focused their monetary policy communication and actions around this proposition. Let me be clear. I am not suggesting a singular focus on price stability that ignores the effects of monetary policy on income and employment. There are often multiple paths to price stability. Central banks should acknowledge in their communications and in their policies that the choices will affect labor markets, and they should opt for those that minimize adverse effects. Volcker, Greenspan, and Bernanke were all flexible inflation targeters, even if the first two didn't call it that. Success. Success begins with clarity about the mandate and with a coherent explanation of how policy actions support it. That explanation is a key to successful policy. Models help organize a complicated world and illuminate historical relationships, but they are simplifications. They depend on assumptions, incomplete knowledge, imperfect representations of human behavior. In practice, policy making requires something more: a narrative, a disciplined story about what is happening in the economy, what forces are driving outcomes, and how policy should respond. Models inform that story, but they cannot substitute for it. The narrative must be grounded in evidence, internally coherent, and open to revision when facts change. That last requirement points to two essential policy-making virtues, in my view: flexibility and humility. Recognizing when a story no longer fits the evidence is often harder than constructing it in the first place. Paul Volcker offers an example. In 1979, he embraced monetary targeting because he believed controlling money growth was necessary to reduce inflation and because it freed policymakers from pretending they knew precisely what interest rate path would restore price stability. By the summer of 1982, however, circumstances had changed. Inflation had fallen, though it remained quite elevated. Unemployment and interest rates were extraordinarily high. Strains in the banking system were emerging, and financial deregulation had weakened the relationship between money growth and inflation. Volcker adapted. He moved back toward interest rate targeting without abandoning the longer-run objective of restoring price stability. Alan Greenspan greatly admired what Volcker had accomplished, and he was determined to finish the job. He was very clear that price stability remained the lodestar of monetary policy. He leaned hard against any early signs of a coming uptick. He was preemptive on inflation, and he monitored inflation expectations carefully for hints of backsliding. But inflation by that time was sufficiently low that he didn't see the need to put the economy through the ringer to achieve that last mile. Greenspan always had a narrative to back his policy recommendations, albeit it was sometimes unconventional and occasionally hard to understand, even for those of us who heard it every day, but one that could be and was often altered by new information and insights. His ability to shift the narrative, to be flexible, and policy in a timely way was key to the soft landing of 1993-94 and to the accommodation of the productivity surge in the mid-1990s. Bernanke confronted a different challenge. In 2007, he pivoted quickly from concerns about inflation toward stabilizing a deteriorating financial system and cushioning the macroeconomic fallout. Volcker, Greenspan, and Bernanke differed in style and circumstance, but they shared a willingness to revise views when events challenged their prior assumptions. They were flexible. Flexibility, in turn, rests on a certain kind of humility. None of these chairs lacked confidence, but all understood the limits of their knowledge. They were suspicious of dogmatic forecasts and policy positions. They reached out widely for new ideas to test their own. Ben Bernanke faced a very different set of challenges after the financial markets began to freeze up in 2007. He provided very clear direction that we were going to supply the liquidity that stabilized institutions in the markets, but he reached out to other policymakers and to staff for ideas about how to accomplish this in unprecedented circumstances. He sent emails called blue sky emails, which encouraged us all to think new and fresh about how to stabilize the situation. Strong staff are an often underappreciated asset in conducting successful policy. Good staff empowered to speak their minds will be a resource for policymakers to test ideas in informal conversations. Staff will provide institutional memory while also being an avenue for bringing new ideas and the most recent research into policy analysis. Staff papers contribute to the transparency and accountability by exposing thinking and models informing policy to outside critical analysis. Staff forecasts are most often the starting place for the discussion of the economy and policy. All three of these chairs interacted extensively and in substantive ways with their staff. Communication. Good communication is essential to preserving central bank independence. Independence in a democracy requires accountability, public understanding, and the logic behind the policy, that narrative I was talking about a few minutes ago, why actions are taken and how they connect to legislative objectives is part of that accountability. Communication also improves effectiveness when markets understand the central bank's reaction function. Policy works more efficiently through expectations and financial conditions under those circumstances. Paul Volcker was skeptical of extensive transparency. He worried that policymakers would be held hostage to forecasts that reality might quickly invalidate and that excessive specificity could constrain flexibility. But even Volcker recognized that major policy shifts required public explanation. He communicated extensively around the move to monetary targeting and again around the shift away from it through speeches, testimony, and press conferences. Equally important, Volcker engaged directly with constituencies most affected by tight policy. These were often uncomfortable encounters, I can vouch for that, but they demonstrated that the Federal Reserve was listening and provided an opportunity to explain why short-term pain was necessary to secure long-term gain. Greenspan inherited some of Volcker's skepticism, but gradually concluded that unnecessary uncertainty reduced policy effectiveness. Beginning in 1994, the Federal Reserve immediately announced policy decisions and increasingly explained the reasoning behind them. In 1999, the FOMC began to release a statement after each policy meeting, even where policy hadn't changed, and that statement also included a form of forward guidance and the likely direction, the tilt, the bias, the likely direction of the next move in interest rates. Bernanke extended this evolution, considerably expanding forecast, introducing regular press conferences, and in the service of both effectiveness and accountability. Greater transparency, however, creates challenges. Communication must remain consistent with the flexibility and humility required for good policy making. Forecasts should communicate uncertainty, not false precision. Central banks know less than outsiders assume and should say so plainly. Scenario analysis can help explain risks and alternative outcomes without overstating confidence in any single path. The same caution applies to forward guidance. Policy projections cannot become commitments that inhibit course correction when circumstances change. Forward guidance is especially valuable near the effective lower bound when policymakers need to shape expectations about future accommodation. Away from the lower bound, clear communication about the policy framework and the economic narrative should reduce the need for explicit rate guidance. Communication with legislators deserves particular emphasis. No constituency matters more for central bank independence. Better understanding can improve oversight, strengthen accountability, reinforce institutional legitimacy. Jay Powell has devoted substantial effort to congressional outreach, and despite intense political pressure, broad support for monetary independence has largely held. Powell has also provided a master class in communication when attacked by the president. He tuned out the noise for as long as possible, not responding and emphasizing the policy was made on the best analysis possible without regard to politics. But when the legal system was enlisted in the attack, he called it out, rallying support. Communication with the broader public is more difficult. Most citizens rationally devote little attention to central banking when inflation is low, growth is steady, and institutions function well. But when inflation rises or independence is questioned, public attitudes matter. Central banks therefore need to keep experimenting with ways to explain their role beyond specialist audiences. Success will be limited, especially in a media environment shaped by social platforms that reward speed, emotion, and oversimplification. Still, engagement matters. Institutions staffed by technocrats must show that they are listening as well as explaining. The challenge of unsustainable fiscal trajectories. Public finances are on unsustainable paths in many advanced economies. Debt relative to income has risen to historically high peacetime levels, and in many countries is projected to continue increasing because of aging populations, geopolitical demands, persistent structural deficits. That is going to put pressure on interest rates, and along with strong investment demand, including AI-related capital spending, may keep interest rates above growth rates for a time, limiting the ability of governments to stabilize debt burdens without major policy changes. The extreme concern is that fiscal dominance, a loss of confidence in government debt that pressures the central bank to finance public borrowing and subordinates monetary policy to fiscal needs, sacrificing price stability and independence. That is not our current situation. But fiscal pressures can threaten independence well before outright fiscal dominance emerges. Persistent deficits imply increasing debt service obligations impinging on other government priorities. President Trump has justified his call for lower rates in his efforts to control the Federal Reserve in part on budgetary grounds. Governments facing constrained fiscal space may also expect monetary policy to shoulder more responsibility during downturns or crises, even when monetary tools are poorly suited to the problem. Financial crises, for example, require close coordination, as Neil and I demonstrated in 2008 and 9. The central banks address liquidity while fiscal authorities address solvency. Severe downturns at the effective lower bound often require monetary and fiscal policy to work together. Central banks do not make fiscal policy, but they can clarify its consequences. In the United States, Federal Reserve officials have generally become more cautious about prescribing specific fiscal actions, I think appropriately recognizing the limits of technocratic authority. Volcker and especially Greenspan were more willing to comment directly on taxes and spending, sometimes too willing in my view, especially for Alan Greenspan. Subsequent chairs focused less on policy prescriptions and more on economic implications. Bernanke advocated less fiscal restraint during the weak post-crisis recovery. Powell supported fiscal support during the pandemic recovery when monetary policy alone seemed to be insufficient. Powell has repeatedly warned that current fiscal trajectories are unsustainable and may eventually limit government's ability to respond to recessions while crowding out productive investment. This strikes me as about the right balance. Central banks should explain the economic consequences clearly and forcefully while avoiding prescriptions about precisely how elected officials should close the fiscal gaps. Fiscal stress also raises operational questions. Asset purchases have been used to address market dysfunction and to support macroeconomic stabilization at the effective lower bound. But central banks will protect themselves by clearly defining purchases undertaken for monetary policy or market functioning purposes, purchases undertaken for those purposes, so they are not mistaken for actions to simply finance the government borrowing or to interfere with appropriate price adjustments. That will require setting out ahead of time criteria and circumstances that might trigger true market dysfunction or monetary policy purpose. Financial stability and central bank independence. Financial stability is a core responsibility of most central banks, even where it's not stated explicitly. In the United States, for example, the Federal Reserve was created in large part to mitigate the recurring financial stress panics of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was given tools to do so: bank supervision, liquidity provision to individual commercial banks at the discount window, and eventually broader open market operations and emergency lending powers to non-banks. Yet financial stability represents special challenges for independence because responsibility is often shared. In the United States and elsewhere, central banks operate alongside other supervisory and regulatory agencies. Many focus primarily on the safety and soundness of individual institutions rather than system-wide resilience. Central banks also generally lack authority over non-bank intermediaries where risk may accumulate. Central banks nevertheless bring distinctive perspective. Because monetary policy works through financial conditions, central banks operate at the intersection of macroeconomics and financial markets. They monitor vulnerabilities across institutions and markets and are uniquely positioned to assess how shocks may propagate through the broader economy. Independence matters here as well. Short-term political incentives may favor deregulation that stimulates credit and activity in the near term, while increasing systemic fragility over time. A degree of insulation allows policymakers to take the longer view. When instability strikes, the central bank's capacity to provide liquidity becomes indispensable. One early episode in my career illustrates the point. Following the 1987 stock market crash, when equity prices fell more than 20% in a single day, the Federal Reserve responded with a brief but powerful statement affirming its readiness to supply liquidity to support the functioning of the financial system. That statement, reinforced by extra open market operations, easing policy, and work behind the scenes to keep to keep payments flowing helps stabilize markets and prevent a broader disruption. Similar principles guided responses in the much more severe crises of 2008 and 2020. Price stability and financial stability are closely connected. Stable financial institutions improve the transmission of monetary policy, while a resilient financial system gives central banks greater confidence to tighten policy when needed without fear of widespread instability. And crises can weaken support for independence. Central bankers are often blamed for failures of supervision or financial excesses, even when responsibility is widely shared. And crisis responses themselves, as we've already discussed, can generate backlash. What then can central banks do? Most importantly, they should continue to articulate clearly their independent assessment of systemic risk, its macroeconomic implications, and the policies necessary to address it. In the United States, regulatory authorities becoming more closely aligned with the priorities of elected administrations. Among other causes, the tenure of the vice chair for supervision has become tied to the change in administrations, strengthening the influence of the individual administrations inside the Federal Reserve. That is appropriate to a degree. Regulation, as we've already said, is more political than monetary policy because it has disproportionate effects across firms and sectors. But responsibility under the Federal Reserve Act ultimately rests with the Board of Governors as a whole. The public interest is best served when the Federal Reserve brings an independent, system-wide perspective to regulatory discussions and remains willing to speak candidly about systemic vulnerabilities, even when that view differs from the administration's. Such judgments are necessarily imperfect. Stress tests are useful, but they are model and scenario dependent and don't cover all risks. Central banks should therefore use their macroeconomic perspective to resist pro-cyclical tendencies in regulation and in private risk-taking, and to identify vulnerabilities that may otherwise be overlooked. Where risks are shared across agencies, central banks should first seek persuasion and coordination, but when concerns are ignored, public communication through financial stability reports, speeches, and testimonies may become necessary. Over time, credibility and independence depend on exercising judgment well. In conclusion, these are difficult times for central banks. The economic environment is challenging. Supply shocks have complicated the return to low and stable inflation after the inflation surge of 2021-23. Tariffs, geopolitical fragmentation, and concerns about supply chains resilience may continue to place upward pressure on prices while weighing on real incomes. At the same time, central banks operate in a political environment that is increasingly polarized, impatient, and skeptical of technocratic institutions. Rising public debt has heightened the fiscal consequences of monetary policy decisions. Reactions against post-crisis regulation may increase financial vulnerabilities even as central banks attempt to preserve resilience. In such an environment, pressures on independence are likely to grow rather than recede. History nevertheless offers an encouraging lesson. Central bank independence has endured not because it is theoretically elegant, but because experience repeatedly demonstrates its value. We know from difficult experience that neither price stability nor financial stability is likely to be sustained without some insulation from short-term political pressure. That insulation, however, cannot be taken for granted. It must be earned and re-earned. The strongest protections are not legal alone. They rest on disciplined focus, institutional competence, humility about uncertainty, and a willingness to explain difficult choices clearly and candidly. I have tried, drawing on my own experience and on that of the central banks with whom I work most closely, to suggest how institutions might preserve support for their independence in this more difficult era. I'll conclude with a reminder from Paul Volcker. In the last analysis, independence rests on perceptions of high confidence, of unquestioned integrity, of broad experience, of non-conflicted judgment, and the will to act. Clear lines of accountability to the Congress and the public need to be honored. Thank you.
Don, that was great. So much great content there. A lot to digest and react to. I have a handful of questions that I've jotted down, and then we're going to open it up to the floor to hear from all of you as well. So please think about your questions. I want to start with accountability. This is a question that I've gotten that I found when I answered it, the audience didn't find it particularly persuasive. So I'm curious how you will answer it. The Fed has had 5 years of elevated inflation. We wildly missed our inflation target coming out of COVID. Inflation, depending on the measure, got to 7, 8, even 9%, and our target's 2%. Nobody was fired. Where's the accountability?
So, of course, there were some attempts to fire. Is this on now?
Be closer to it.
Okay. There were attempts to fire people, but not attempts that I agreed with. I think the accountability comes from the Congress. It comes from the institution themselves, holding themselves accountable. I was pleased to see the Federal Reserve when it redid its strategic framework to remove the inflation bias from the what I thought was an inflation bias from the 2020 framework. So in effect, the Fed said that might not have been the wisest thing to do. I think the other point, another helpful point, is that when I applaud Jay Powell and you guys on the FOMC for when you realized you made a mistake, moving very, very rapidly to correct it. Unprecedented speed, a series of 75 basis points. So I think to some extent, but what I missed actually, what I would like to see, would have liked to have seen is part of that strategic review, which was framed as strategy, tools, and communication. You never looked at tools. So I thought a chance was missed to say, what did we get wrong about our forward guidance, about forward guidance on interest rates and forward guide on asset purchases. So I think the public would have been reassured. I know that not doing that sort of when you're already under fire by the president doing it is very difficult because you feel like you're handing ammunition to somebody. But I think ultimately, this FOMC handing lessons down to future FOMCs, here's what we did right, here's what we did wrong, I missed that. So I think there were a number of corrective steps that were taken, and I wish more had been done. The Bank of England brought in Ben Bernanke and others to look, outsiders to look at how they had done and analyze that. I think that would have been a helpful thing to show the public that you were holding yourselves accountable.
Thank you. Another question. You talked about the loss of credibility of technocrats around the world. Obviously, it's not just in economics. If I think about the COVID response and the damage to reputations of public health officials who are doing their best in extraordinarily uncertain times, but the people grew very frustrated, I think, with a lot of public health pronouncements. You talked about the need for humility, which I firmly agree with. I mean, experts are wrong much more often than we all would like to admit that we're wrong, and that damages credibility. But at the same time, if we went out and admitted how little we actually understand about the inflation process, wouldn't that also damage our credibility? So I'm just curious how you think about how much to share.
Well, there is a balance there, isn't there? I mean, you don't want to overstate what you know, and I do think the health experts, there was in the COVID, the response to COVID, there was this follow the science, as if science was some God on top that gave you the answers that you needed to do. But science is experiments, is probabilities, is learning new things, particularly about a new disease. And I think the health experts presented their recommendations as black and white and firm, and the same problem would go for central banks that say, we know what to do. Here's our analysis. We're really confident in it. That's an uncertainty. I think you have to acknowledge that. I think you need to be honest with the public, and I think it can be done without harming confidence. And I think it's really important, this focus, keeping your eye on the long-term goal, trying to relate have a narrative about what you're doing relative to that goal, but not be so fixed on exactly how many rate increases or rate decreases will take to get there.
Just a couple more questions, and I'm going to open it up. Focusing on the U.S. for a second, our dual mandate gets a lot of attention because it's pretty unique. A lot of times people say, well, this is why you missed on inflation. You were distracted by this employment mandate. You explain how they are related to each other. But would our lives just be simpler from a communications and credibility perspective? Even if practically it didn't change what we did, would we be in a better position if we simply had a single mandate, do you think?
No. I mean, I think here's what I tried to advocate in that talk. Returning to something more like Greenspan, Bernanke, Volcker, Greenspan, and early Bernanke before the crisis, pointing out the relationship. We need price stability so that the economy operates at its most efficient. Price stability is, in a sense, the path to maximum employment. And I think that got lost, and including in this so-called balanced approach to these supply shocks. The balanced approach to me sounds very mechanical. We're going to measure how far we are from each target and how long it's going to be, and then gauge our policy, and ignores some of the relationships between the two targets. I was pleased to see the new strategy things say that maximum employment is the highest level of employment consistent with price stability. So you did that, but I think you could have gone the other direction as well. Price stability is necessary to get to maximum employment, and that would give a better focus for your communication.
Great. Okay, one more question from me. Back to focusing on the U.S. for a second. You talked about this, independence of monetary policy. Central banks do things beyond just monetary policy. What about some type of a reform that says, okay, monetary policy will be independent, but the other parts, the other responsibilities of the central bank will formally not be independent?
Well, I think you're kind of there already in the United States, right? So regulation, even supervisory guidance, usually requires all the agencies to agree. What worries me, Neil, is that since the crisis and this vice chair for supervision, the Fed seems to have ceded more and more authority to the administrations. And maybe this is glossing over the past more than it should, but my experience is the Fed provided a little bit of a balance wheel. We recognized, I say in the 80s and the 90s when I was in there, 2000s, recognized that we needed to get all these agencies together, but we also pushed, for example, in the early 2000s for guidance on commercial real estate, on subprime lending. Now, we were blocked to some extent by the other agencies, but I don't have the sense in this more politicized environment that the Fed is taking that macro perspective and resisting some things. I may be wrong. I don't know what's going on inside, but I'd like to see. I'd like to see more evidence that the financial stability implications of some of the deregulation that's going on now are being considered.
Thank you, Don. Let me open it up to the audience for questions. I think if you put your card on its side, maybe I'll be able to see you, or turn your microphone on. Claire.
Thanks very much, Don. That was absolutely terrific. It was really great, very broad, a lot to think about, a lot to reflect on, but also quite practical. So really grateful for that. I wanted to ask you to put your advice a bit in practice for the challenge that some of us are facing now, and just to get your advice on that, which is, you said that there are multiple paths that can deliver price stability at any time. Which could suggest, and that we should think about the impact on employment and activity, whatever your structure of mandate. So that could suggest sort of looking through temporary shock, supply side, if we're in a sort of theoretical world. But you also talked about the importance of inflation expectations and then being grounded. And we are seeing some changes to inflation expectations now. So I wonder, how would you square off, what is your advice on how we think about those challenges at the moment when we're thinking about the credibility issues as well that we're sort of challenged by? Thanks.
So I agree that policy can look through these price level changes, provided you avoid the second round effects. I do think that I'm keeping careful eye on second round effects. So one thing that central banks talk a lot about is inflation expectations, but also, and we saw in Governor Ueda's conversation also, some attention to wages and whether labor markets are perpetuating. I worried about this coming out of COVID, that rising wage increases, attempts to catch up, would perpetuate that. So I think there are multiple second round, and Governor Ueda was right also to emphasize it's a lot of the effects will depend on the initial conditions when you're going in. So I think there are lots of things to think about there. The theory of looking through is the right theory, but in practice, and then because we've come through 5 years of above target inflation in the US, and I think in the UK as well, I think that also implies that you should pay special attention to the risks that those second round effects will occur, and lean a bit against that. I don't know if that's hopeful or not. Probably not. But yeah, it's a tough situation. But also not avoid talking about it. So I like the fact that at Jackson Hole in 22, I guess, when Jay Powell said, we're going after inflation, and it may cause some pain, at least he said that, right? And in the end, it didn't. It was great. It was magnificently engineered by the Federal Reserve and most other central banks. But I think admitting that and trying to look, maybe we talk about scenario analysis a lot. Maybe among the scenarios would be how fast to get back to full employment if you're not there, or how to avoid changes in the output gap, or what the scenarios are for different output gaps. So that would be perhaps a way of discussing this. But I was thinking as I wrote that section, Claire, about Mervin's speech about inflation nutters. And so, not an inflation nutter. Don't think anybody in this room should be an inflation nutter. You've got to pay attention to the other part of the macro economy.
Should we just go down the line? So I think Andrew.
Thank you, Don. And you said that central bankers should explain the economic consequences of fiscal positions clearly and forcefully, whilst avoiding policy prescriptions, if my notes are right. Have those, clear and forceful explanations made any difference to the fiscal position we find ourselves in now? I know there are some ECB colleagues in the room, and we have a variant of this in Australia. Some central banks talk a lot about fiscal policy, a great deal, not obviously to any great end. Others don't at all. Is it a sort of necessary thing to do that won't, at the same time, won't actually make any difference, or can we point to something that's actually worked in that respect? Thanks.
You're right that it doesn't seem to have made difference in some countries. My impression, at least until recently, Neil, was that the Federal Reserve had been unusually reticent to talk about the macroeconomic consequences of unsustainable fiscal policy. And I think maybe as he got towards the end of his term, I don't know, Jay became more vocal on that. And I think that's the only path we have. We can't make policy, fiscal policy, right? We've got to tell people that we're aware of the macroeconomic consequences of the fiscal decisions that are being made. I don't see anything else to do. And I think I'll go back to public support for independence. I mean, if you're not telling the public what the consequences are, you're going to lose support, even if the fiscal authorities don't react. So I think you gotta give it your best shot.
But even that though, Don. So if we go back 5 or 6 years, we were in the period that was described as secular stagnation, and there was a lot of prominent economists saying now is the time to load up on the public sector spending. So that's when the questions were about should we do more. And then the other question that I get a lot is, well, how much debt is too much, right? When is the danger zone? So how powerfully should Fed officials warn about the unsustainable fiscal trajectory when there's so much uncertainty about what is the danger zone?
Right.
Japan being a great example of having no trouble financing itself at higher levels of debt. Obviously, there are a lot of subtleties that are driving those differences.
But there's a lot of evidence, isn't there, Neil, that rising debt to income ratios produce higher interest rates. The CBO uses 2 basis points a percentage point, I think, or something like that. But you can make that point. You're going to have higher interest rates. They're going to hurt in terms of your fiscal space in the current jargon for other things you want to do. You're going to crowd out private investment. So I think making those points, you need to make those points.
Right. Keep going.
Yes, thanks, Don. Really very interesting speech covering a lot of ground. I wanted to come back to what Neil asked, the fact that we have different spheres where the central bank operates, and independence can be interpreted differently in these different spheres. There is monetary policy, but then there is also financial authority. And we can think that, especially when we have financial risks and rising inflation, it might be hard to maintain the separation principle ex post. Once you're into a crisis and you have to choose whether you raise rates when that might endanger your financial system, you're less likely to do that. And I think there is evidence that the separation principle doesn't hold all the time. Now, ex ante, you'd want to regulate the financial system so that it doesn't happen. But when you don't have the authority to do that, you have to take the environment as it is. And so effectively, the political side can put you in a situation where it forces you to be intervening ex post, even if it's, at that point it might be optimal, not optimal from an ex ante perspective. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think I tried to hint at that was one of my concerns, that without a resilient financial system, the central bank could be reticent about tightening when it needed to tighten to fight inflation. Of course, what can you do about that? I think you can voice the concerns. You can lean on the other regulators. Often, of course, these financial crises are recessions, so the central banks are easing policy. It doesn't become a conflict, but it could. I don't think there's an easy answer here. In speeches I made while I was a governor, I very much supported the separation principle. I didn't like the idea of sacrificing employment and the inflation goal for a theoretical financial instability situation, as maybe the Riksbank was doing for a while. So I strongly think that when you just have to cope with the situation when you're in it, I think. I don't, and I guess just going back, often the financial crisis, when it breaks, there's not really a conflict. Everything's pointing towards these zero interest rates.
Marcus?
Yeah, I would like to come back about independence and the standing of the central bank in the public. Can you elaborate a little bit what it implies for communications policy? So should you communicate primarily to the Wall Street or also to Main Street? And Ben Bernanke did the 60-minute interview. He made a concerted effort to go to Main Street. But there was a big difference between Alan Greenspan and Ben, essentially, in terms of transparency, how open you communicate, and how secretive you keep things. But how important would you say is the communication of the general public relative to the technocratic public? How would you balance the two, 50-50 or 90-10?
I think it's really important, Marcus. And you have to keep trying. I think even if you're not successful, just being seen as trying to communicate, I think, is helpful. The most important thing is communicating with the legislators, and Jay Powell did a masterful job of that, and certainly my recommendation to Chairman Warsh is to continue wearing out the carpets, as Powell said, to both parties in Congress. So you can do that, and trying to explain policy without a lot of jargon. But I think reaching out to the public is important without maybe overreacting. So maybe this is a question for Neil. So one hears that the Fed listens stuff in 2018, 2019, leading up to the 2020, kind of influenced the strategic, the emphasis on full employment, because when the Fed reached out and listened to people, they talked about jobs, they talked about their income, they didn't talk about inflation because there hadn't been inflation for 15 years or whatever. And I kind of worry whether the Fed listened too hard.
Well, there's a lot underneath that question for me to respond to. My reaction to the Fed Listens events was, I think for the reserve banks, because we're out in our districts our day job, every day we're out in our districts, we were hearing this feedback. So for me, what I heard in the Fed Listens events wasn't news to me, but I do think for a lot of folks in Washington who are in Washington full time, it was more eye-opening for them to be able to hear some of that feedback directly. We would talk about a lot of these issues in the FOMC meetings, but it's one thing hearing it from me representing what I heard in my district. It's another thing for people to hear directly from the constituents. So I found them quite effective, but you're suggesting that maybe we overlearned in that moment. That's a debate for a longer session.
Right.
Philip.
I suppose I have one question and one comment. So if you had a magic wand, Don, would you put Fed independence in the Constitution of the US Constitution? I mean, because for us, the fact where the independence is in the treaty does essentially mean it's much less under discussion than if it's just basically a law of Congress.
Right.
So that's my question. My comment is a lot. I mean, 99% of what you say, I think, fully applies to the European situation as well. But just in passing, I think I heard you say that maintaining focus means maybe not getting into topics such as climate change. And here, I mean, obviously there's a lot going on, but you know, a large part of what the ECB does is more, if you like, positive economics. I mean, when we try to explain what's behind inflation in Europe, you know, one basic issue, for example, is essentially the ETS scheme, which is raising essentially carbon taxes in Europe. And so this is, in a low inflation world, the decisions about administered prices coming from the political world does make a difference. Right. And if we're trying to be transparent about what's driving inflation, climate policy is a relevant issue. I mean, in the US, you can have different issues in terms of explaining how fiscal affects inflation. But you know, I would say a lot of what we do is simply stating the facts as opposed to saying that monetary policy is some extra objective or anything like that. So that's more of a comment. But as I say, it's really the constitutional is my question.
So my impression, if I can comment on the comment, my impression, and certainly the intersection of climate change and financial stability is a legitimate subject for central banks. And I know when the Fed has been attacked for getting into climate change issues, I think the main defense has been really we were looking at the financial stability implications. I'm not sure that was true of all the research going on at the reserve banks or the Federal Reserve Board. We weren't putting our thumb on the scale of climate change, but it's something that's happening we needed to look at. I guess my impression for the ECB is that it was more than positive economics. I mean, you were trying to help the policymakers fight climate change through the bond portfolio, et cetera. You can correct me later over coffee. On the constitutional question, it'd be great, but it's not going to happen, right? So we're in the world we're in, and I think we need to work in that world, build the support in the public and the legislators in various ways, focus on that. So the Fed is often very reluctant to open up the Federal Reserve Act, much less to start a conversation about embedding independence in the Constitution. So I think the premise for my talk was we're in the world we're in. How do we live there? How do we support independence in that?
Okay, we only have a few more minutes left. I see Ellie. We see three questions, 1, 2, and then 3 here, back there. Ellie?
Don, that was masterful discussion of the threats to independence, especially the discussion about financial stability and unsustainable fiscal trajectories. Right. In relation to the latter, in emerging markets, I think there has been a tendency, and I think Pierre-Olivier can confirm this, to take seriously the idea of a debt to GDP ratio and so on. They can be so obsessed with that they end up going to the central bank and asking the central bank to help finance the deficits so they don't count as debt. Instead, their money creation, they underestimate, or I think they don't understand how money creation can lead to so much inflation. They see it as free resources. It's very hard to communicate that money creation leads to inflation. So that's the dilemma we have in many emerging markets, I would say.
Right. Although I think the lesson has been learned. We're having a conversation at dinner last night. It's amazing how well the emerging markets have emerged from these supply shocks that we've had and kept inflation anchored. And because they recognize the importance of the price stability mandate. They've separated fiscal and monetary policies. I think people are learning that lesson. The analogy in the U.S. situation is the president calling for lower interest rates in order to relieve pressure on the budget. And that is a very dangerous thing to do. And I think Jay Powell was absolutely right not to just not engage in that. But I guess if I were wearing out the carpets on the way to the Congress, that would be one of the things I would point out. We can't lower interest rates to help you guys finance this deficit. We've already got an inflation problem. That's got to be our priority. And lowering interest rates to help you with the deficit is just going to make the inflation problem worse. That's a lesson that has to be driven home over and over and over again.
So thank you, Don. So since you looked at the kind of the history and evolution, especially in the context of the U.S., and you were, self-critical on the part of central bankers, was there a kind of lack of education when it comes to value of independence, even in the context of the U.S.? Because my impression is that the literature, and you basically have these conversations, we tend to look at the episodic cases. But I see recently, because of these discussions, some good analytical work, basically quantifying the lack of independence in terms of inflation, in terms of growth. Maybe there is a serious lack of, research on these issues. Among each other, we understand this, but not necessarily we are communicating the cost of giving up independence.
So I think there's been a lot of research. I certainly have taken it as given for many years that where the politicians make policy, and we have so much evidence from Turkey to other countries, right? Except them raising her hand. So I think it's almost become self-evident, or just look around and you see it everywhere. But I think the education isn't so much of the economists. I think it's this discussion we've been having about educating ordinary people. In my interactions with congressmen and senators, they recognize that. They'll say, look at the lousy job we're doing with fiscal policy. We know we can't be trusted with monetary policy. But they're also a little bit hesitant to the Republicans to buck the chairman. And Democrats, I've always felt that a lot of them, their support for price stability was kind of half-hearted. So I think we need to keep that education process going. This is not a very satisfying answer, I get it, but I started down this path of this speech a couple months ago, and I thought, I'm going to come up with some really cool answers, and I surveyed a bunch of current and former central bankers. What do you think? And it all came down to the same thing: focus, success, communication. There wasn't any magic bullet to do all this.
Last question, please.
Thank you, and thank you for a very inspiring and important speech. So my question is, would there be a conflict between data dependence and more of a strategy for forward guidance, like in a communication policy, and also what you talked about right now in educating people, in relation to educating people? Is that a problem that you have just data dependence statements? Thank you.
So I think the data dependence has to be in perspective. I mean, one of the things I said, a hard part of monetary policy making is figuring out when you should change, when the narrative isn't working out. And that's incoming data, right? Incoming things that don't quite match up with what you thought. So the data are very important, but I also worry from time to time whether data dependence hasn't implied too much emphasis on the most recent piece of data. So I think the narrative is really important. How does the data fit into the narrative? What is it telling me about that? What about its data feeding into forecasts and the narrative shaping the forecast? So yes, of course you're data dependent. You'd be crazy not to pay any attention to the incoming data, right? It's telling you something, but it has to be sifted and folded into the broader narrative, and overreacting to individual pieces of data. I mean, when the market reacts to a CPI, 1 month CPI or something, that it's, to some extent, they're trying to guess what Neil and Laurie and Philip are going to do in their FOMC things. So I think somehow the FOMC may have given them the impression that they're really dependent on the next piece of data. It's really important. So it's got to be important, but it has to be folded into the broader story.
Don, that was terrific. Please join me in thanking Don Kohn.